Hello and welcome back. In this video, we will take a look at the last UML relationship, aggregation. So in the couple of videos prior to this, we have looked at generalization, realization, and association. Now let's take a look at aggregation. And as I mentioned earlier, two major types, non-shared aggregation and shared aggregation. So let's take a look at what we mean by non-shared and shared aggregation. I prefer to use the word non-shared, and I'll tell you why in a second. Let me start with an example. Before we look at non-shared and shared aggregation, there's one thing we need to be very clear about. Aggregation is actually a specific kind of an association. So it is kind of an association. So the question is, so when do we say we actually have an aggregation? The keywords that one has to remember while doing the aggregation model is whole-part relationship. Only if you have a whole-part relationship as part of the system that you're trying to build, you've got to look at aggregation, because else it just becomes an association. And as you will notice through the rest of this particular video, in terms of code, there may actually not be too much differences. There's actually no differences between aggregation and association in terms of how the code would look. But it's the business problem that we're trying to model is the one that needs to tell us whether we actually have an aggregation or an association. So let's look at aggregation. So remember the keywords, a whole and a part relationship. Let's start with a simple example. Now look at any of the window objects that you might have actually opened on your the video right now, or any of the applications that you use. What does a window consist of? Yes, it consists of a lot of other things, but I'm showing three main things here. Any given window, application window, consists of one main panel where the main content of whatever the application you've opened shows up. It typically has a navigation bar, and they probably have a scroll bar. So let me write the relationships here. So the relationship I want is composition. I'll come to that in a bit. The word composition itself in a bit. Let me write this. So again, please note, I'm starting from the side of the part and I'm dragging it towards the whole. I'm going to do the same thing here, and I'm going to do the same thing here. So first off, let's understand the notations themselves. So in terms of UML notation, you actually have a non-shared aggregation, and the symbol used is a diamond, and it is filled. And the diamond is always on the side of the whole. It's the window that's the whole object, and these are the various parts that we're talking about. And in terms of multiplicity on terms of the whole is equal to 1. It's always equal to 1. Whereas the multiplicity on the whole side should be 1. So this should be windows consists of one particular panel. So this is correct. So on the other side, which is side 2, this will always be 1. I'm not going to draw it for all the other three, but you should notice that the multiplicity on the whole side will always be equal to 1. Now look at the words that we used. We said non-shared, and we are trying to model a whole part relationship. Window is the whole object, panel, nav bar, and scroll bars are the actual parts. Why is it called non-shared? It's actually called as non-shared because it's trying to say once you have a panel and a nav bar and a scroll bar, 1 to 2, you cannot take them and associate that with any other window. So what we are saying is, if I actually have a scroll bar and a panel for my Word application open, there is no way I can drag out this particular parts and associate that with something like Firefox or Excel spreadsheet, so to speak. That's why it's called as non-shared. And hence I prefer to use the word non-shared, because that itself tells you what type of a model you're trying to create. So also note, it's this non-shared aggregation is what we commonly call as composition. So you can use the word composition, that's perfectly fine, because that's what we mean by it. But if you look at it in terms of non-shared, that itself will help you understand as to what it tries to say. So it's basically saying you have in your system, if you have a condition where you're trying to model a whole and a parts relationship, and from a business standpoint, it makes no sense for the same parts to be shared between more than one whole. If and only if you have this kind of condition is when you got to model for composition or non-shared aggregation. Now I have drawn another example here, and if you are from any of the retail kind of domain, you probably would have known this particular example. If not, just open up any of the bills that you might actually have. And if you notice, that's how the bills or the invoices are always produced. A order can actually consist of multiple order line items or line items, and it's the line item which basically refers to a specific product, and it'll talk about the quantity, the price of that particular product, what is the line item total, so on and so forth. So what we are trying to say here is, once I have sold a particular line item to a particular person, or it belongs to a particular order, there is in no way I can take that and associate that particular line item with some other order. And hence, even this is a very, very good example of a whole part relationship where the part cannot be shared between more than one whole. And hence, it's a very good example of a composition or non-shared aggregation. Hence, composition or non-shared aggregation implies two things. It implies that the parts that we actually have here, based on the example shown here, do not have an independent life cycle of their own. And what we mean by that is, if I were to close down the Word application that I'm using and I close down that particular window, when I close that down, the panel, the navbar and the scroll bars, which were parts that were making up this particular whole, also are actually destroyed. They cannot exist. So the second implication is that the individual parts themselves do not have a life cycle of their own, and it's the whole part that actually controls the entire life cycle of these parts. So that's the implication because of our composition example, that composition relationship that we talked about. Let's continue, take that further. I actually now I'm going to move towards in shared aggregation, but let me give you one more example. Now let's assume that I'm the manufacturer of computers, and when I sell it, I have to sell you this particular machine with a hard disk. I'm not, and we only give you predefined models, and you just have to buy a different model if you just basically want a different kind of a hard disk. But if I say SATA hard drive, or if I say it's going to be SSD, this has to be a part of the particular computer. And this part that I'm talking about, the hard disk, you cannot actually share it with some other computer per se. It is meant only for that particular machine that you're actually going to buy. So in that case, that's a very good example of a composition yet again, because we are saying computer consists of so many other parts, and one of the parts actually happens to be a hard disk. So that's again, we are looking at a whole part relationship, whereas the part is meant to be used only within a whole. But look at a slightly different example. What if once you buy that particular machine, you now have an external hard drive or a pen drive, and the purpose of that is for you to use it with more than one computer. So I might actually copy all my stuff from my first machine, my work machine, and I can take it home and plug it onto my personal machine, or vice versa. So in this case, we still are trying to model a whole part relationship, but the difference here is the part that we are talking about can actually be used between more than one whole. I mean, not at the same particular instance, obviously that's not possible, but it's possible for me to use the pen drive against two different whole objects or two computers. So this is when we call it as a shared aggregation. And the symbol, if you notice now, is actually again a diamond, but in this case it is non-filled. So what we are trying to say, again, go by the word that UML uses, shared versus non-shared. It is called as a shared aggregation because the same pen drive could be attached to more than one computer, whereas that is probably not possible for the specific hard drive that goes into a particular laptop or a machine, and that has to be there. So that's the subtle difference between non-shared aggregation and aggregation. Now that we have talked the subtle difference between shared and non-shared aggregation, now let's see what practitioners do on real projects as well. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of code, there really is no difference between aggregation and association. Very much so when it actually comes to shared aggregation and association. Hence, most of the time in real projects, we might actually model this shared aggregation that I've shown here as I'm just going to call as PD2. I mean pen drive by that, and I'm just going to say C2, which means computer 2. We actually end up converting this shared association, shared aggregation that we have represented here into one of the two types of association. It can actually be a directed association, or it can actually be a dependency. So even Ivar Jacobson actually calls this the symbol that they had to come up for this shared aggregation as a placebo, because they had to have a symbol that was against this non-shared aggregation, so they came up with a symbol. But given that it really has no meaning or a specific connotation in terms of the code, there's no difference between this and association, we actually end up converting or modeling all of our models using either directed association or dependency, and not leaving the models at a shared aggregation level. So this is what Ivar Jacobson refers to as a placebo effect, just in terms of a model. And that's basically what we do. And I tend to follow the same approach as well. So if you see any of the class diagrams that I write, you probably will not see any of the shared aggregation per se. I would have converted them to either a direct or a dependency association. And the reason being, it confuses people. If there's going to be no impact in terms of code, why have so many different symbols and confuse everyone? Because it's much easier to explain and understand association. We just end up converting that. So please note, we are not saying convert all non-shared and shared aggregation. We are talking about converting only the shared aggregation to associations. Composition is very much used, and if and only if your business case talks about whole and a part relationship where the parts cannot be shared between more than one whole, then definitely do model that as a composition and leave it that way. But do note that there's going to be no code difference in terms of what you would see in terms of an association as well. But just to avoid the confusion, we convert all the shared aggregations to some kind of an association, either a strong or a weak. Give me one more minute. I'll clean up this particular diagram, and I'll summarize the two types of aggregations that we just looked at. Okay, I'm back. I've basically cleaned up the diagram, and I'm showing the non-shared aggregation and the shared aggregation in two boxes here. So please do note, even in the non-shared aggregation, I've actually added all the multiplicities correctly, and this is what I was trying to refer to last time around when I was saying the multiplicity on the whole side is always 1. That's basically when you actually get a non-shared. The reason for that being, these parts cannot be shared between more than one whole. That's why it's called as non-shared. Whereas when it comes to a shared aggregation, the pen drive or the part can actually be shared between more than one whole, and hence it's called as a shared aggregation. And I'm just showing you two examples here of how the shared aggregation could have been converted either to a strong association or a weak association, depending on the scope of this dependent object. That's left to you as to decide. Look at the scope and then you get to decide. So with that, I come to the conclusion of talking about the 4 major types of relationships in a class diagram and a UML diagram. I hope all the examples have actually been clear. And in the next section, I'm going to be talking about the notations that we need to use or remember or learn about from a sequence diagram perspective. And once we do that, later on we'll see how to write the diagrams themselves. So in the next video, I'll talk to you about notations for the sequence diagrams. I'll see you later then. With that, we come to the end of the notations for the UML class diagrams themselves. I hope all the code examples and the samples that I've written as part of the diagrams will make it clear and easy for you to understand the subtleties between the various types of UML class diagram relationships themselves. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at the notations that we need to learn for sequence diagrams. I'll see you later then.